right. We're rolling.
Now, how long is this going to be?
As long as we want it to be.
It's not how long I want it to be, it's how long you want it to be. I want to take you down to the cemetery this afternoon.
Okay. All right. Today is October 24th, 2018.
Can I sit facing this way? Or
No, you're good. That's good. Just look at me.
Okay.
Are you comfortable?
Yeah, okay. I think so. Okay.
There we go. Today is October 24th, 2018. We're in Gainesville, Florida, at the campus of the University of Florida, at the Hillel House, with
Ralph Lowenstein.
Ralph Lowenstein, who is going to tell us his story of his participation in Mahal, and later on all of your activities of documenting the American and Canadian Mahal people, which has been a big part of the last 20, 30 years of your life.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
Building the museum.
what's that?
And building the museum.
And building the museum, correct. Hold on, I'm just giving you a little bit more light here. Okay.
I also built a major display for the American Jewish Historical Society. It was displayed in New York at the American Jewish History
Sure.
Museum,
Sure.
I don't know, about 10 or 12 years ago.
Okay. We're going to talk about all that right now. But first, I would like to conduct an interview about you and your personal story. And Ralph, I'd like to begin by asking you, could you please tell me where and when you were born and what kind of household you grew up in, and like, what was the background?
I was born in 1930, March the 8th, 1930, in Danville, Virginia. And I was third of three boys. And my mother was a first generation American. She was born in Danville in 1898, where my grandfather, her father, was a haberdashery merchant. And my father was born in Vilna, Lithuania, but came over at the age of 2 with his father and was raised in Wilmington, North Carolina, and later raised in Roanoke, Virginia, and opened the first pawn shop in Danville, Virginia, and was a pawnbroker, very, very respectable one, and was active in the Masonic Order, a great athlete. And
Masonic Order?
Masonic. Masonic Order is a big order of Masons in this country. It's one of the major organizations of Christians and Jews, called the Masonic Order.
How are they different than the Freemasons?
Well, that's it. It's Freemasons.
It's Freemasons.
It's the Freemasons.
Okay.
And he was one of about the second highest rank Knights of Columbus, Knights of something of the Court of Honor, Knights of the Court of Honor, I believe. Very active in that, and of course very active in our synagogue. It was an unusual town in the fact that there were only 50 Jewish families and 2 synagogues, one conservative, one Orthodox, one was extremely Reform. The Orthodox was extremely Orthodox. Women sat upstairs. And I would say of the 50 families, 80% were conservative. But the richest people, the richest 2 men, one of the 2 richest men was an Orthodox Jew, and the second richest man was a Reform Jew, so they mostly supported the synagogues. But the people were pretty much in the middle, I would say.
Where was your family?
Well, I would say they were conservative, but we were in the Orthodox congregation.
Oh, you were in the Orthodox congregation.
My grandfather, my mother's father, was one of the founders of the Orthodox congregation, and my mother claimed that she gave the dime for the first brick for the Orthodox. And my mother was very active in Hadassah. My mother was either
Please tell me the names of your parents.
Yeah, my mother was Rachel Berman Lowenstein, and my mother joined Hadassah about 4 or 5 years after Henrietta Zoll founded the organization, and was either president, vice president, or secretary treasurer of the Danville chapter of Hadassah for 50 consecutive years. Almost a record, I suppose. And so I was raised in a Zionist household. My father was president of the Zionist Organization of America, a small chapter that we had in Danville. They were wonderful parents and gave us a very, very good feeling of independence growing up, which I credit with having a lot to do with my coming to Israel to fight.
What can you tell me about Danville, about the city?
The city, Jews were a very tiny minority. There were Jews, some Greeks, no Italians, no Hispanics, almost no more Catholics than there were Jews. It was a Protestant city, Anglo-Saxon. Most of the people were Anglo-Saxon. Many were mill workers. We had 2 huge mills in Danville. It was 2 industry town. The 2 industries were the tobacco industry. Tobacco, what is called flue-cured tobacco, was grown in the environs of Danville. And Danville was a major tobacco market where the farmers would bring in their tobacco leaf in the fall and have big auctions. Those tobacco warehouses, there must have been 10 tobacco warehouses in Danville, though they didn't manufacture cigarettes or anything. And the other industry was the Dan River cotton mills. We had a very big name at one time. It's called Dan River Fabric. They employed 12,000 people.
12,000?
In 2 plants, too. They were some of the largest tobacco cotton mill factories in the United States. And they actually made cotton cloth, essentially cotton cloth. They didn't make the shirts, trousers, anything like that. They just produced cotton cloth.
Now, is there any, so your parents probably speak English to one another, right?
Yeah. My father, of course, was raised speaking Yiddish. When he came over at the age of 2, he spoke Yiddish. And my grandparents, of course, spoke Yiddish too, but they lived in Wilmington, which was about the size of Danville, I guess. Danville was a city of 35,000 people, and Wilmington was probably about the same size.
Now, that said, you go to public school?
I went to public school.
But do you get out of the house? Is there any kind of youth movement that you're belonging to, or something that's...
Young Judea, we belong to Young Judea, but you have to keep in mind that the Young Judea was maybe 12 people or something like that. It was a very tiny, there were only 50 families.
Yeah. Wow.
And actually, pretty much in the organizations in town, like they had the Helping Hand Society in Hadassah, women from both congregations belonged to it. The people in Danville all knew each other. They knew each other's parents. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody gossiped. They knew everything about everybody else. But there were 2 Jewish cemeteries. There was the Orthodox cemetery, which my grandfather also founded. In fact, he had a haberdashery store called J. Berman, which stayed in the same place more or less for something like 110 years. He was encouraged to come to Danville. It's a long, interesting story, by a captain in the Confederate Army. Danville was the last capital of the Confederacy. The Confederate cabinet was meeting in Danville, Virginia, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
Because they had fled Richmond.
They fled Richmond, and there was a railroad called the Danville-Richmond Railroad, and they had taken the railroad down to Danville, and so Danville was the capital of the Confederacy for 3 days. But it was famous for nothing else. The last capital.
Now,
so there was no fighting, essentially, in Danville and near Danville, because Grant was coming down from the north, and forgot the name of the general who was coming up from the south,
Grant.
Grant was coming down from the north, and Sherman was coming up from the south. Yeah. And basically, the war ended at Appomattox, which was not that far away.
Not that far away from Danville?
It was probably, I would say, 75 miles away.
75 miles. Now, let's get back to you. Of course, I'm sure with the household that you grew up in, you have a bar mitzvah at 13.
Yes, definitely. Orthodox.
Orthodox.
Women sat upstairs.
And when you're already like 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old, you know, do you remember any talk in the house? I know you're a child, but do you remember any talk of the house about what's happening in Europe with the Jews?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I was aware of the Holocaust.
Well, I'm not talking about the Holocaust. I'm talking about Kristallnacht and the Munich
Yeah,
Bomb.
I'm saying.
Is that talked about in the house?
Oh yes, definitely, all the time. My parents were very well read. My mother attended NYU Law School for 1 year. She was the first girl in Danville to go off to law school. She didn't finish because she married my father, sure. but she was had finished a women's like community college in Danville and was admitted to NYU Law School and went to. And my father was a brilliant man. He was intelligent, well read. We got Time magazine and things like that in, but my father was one of 7 children. My mother was one of 9, and college for the most part was not out for him. And but he was well read, knew classical music, a good athlete. He loved to play golf.
What did your father do for a living?
It was a jewelry pawn shop.
Pawn shop. Sorry,
I
forgot.
But actually, Dad had delusions of grandeur in a way, because it wasn't the stereotype of a pawn shop in any way whatsoever. It was a very bright, wide store, and everything was sold. We sold guns, jewelry. Yes, we all, my two older brothers and I, all worked at the store when we were old enough to work in the store. And yeah, definitely. And my father was a very successful merchant as well. I mean, he was a very good, but he died at the age of 52. He was a heavy smoker. Ironically, Danville was called the world's best tobacco market. But Mother didn't smoke or drink coffee, anything. My mother lived to be 88. But they were well-read. And one of the first messages that I got, I still have a copy of it, is a letter from Mother's father's and mother's relatives in Poland. They were both from Poland, grandparents were from Poland, but had come over to the United States in their teens, in the 1880s. My mother's parents had come over in the 1880s. My father's came over in 1898. But anyway, relatives asking for money, and finally one letter came from Lutz, that they were in a concentration camp in Lutz, and they had been kicked out of their homes, which is a place called Chekhanov, and asking for money, but it was written in German. And the Jewish fathers, city fathers, so to speak, said that if they sent any money, it would just go into German hands. But before that, they had been sending money to relatives, especially my mother's relatives in Poland. And we knew everything. I can hardly remember when I didn't know what was going on in Europe, probably from the age of 7 or 8. And my mother was an officer in Hadassah, so basically we had all the Hadassah meetings were held in homes, very often in our home. And I can remember sitting at the head of the stairs, at the top of the stairway leading into the living room, listening to Zionist and Palestinian leaders speaking to the Jewish women. For example, Dr. I can't remember his first name, but Loudermilk, who was very famous for suggesting a waterway from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea that would make hydroelectric power, speaking there. And Hadassah leaders in those days came through the smallest towns. Some of my mother's best friends were national leaders in Hadassah because they would come through and speak to these small groups.
At your house a lot of the times.
Yeah, and we were a very Zionist house. So.
Now I'm going to jump a few years to 1945. The war's over. You're 15. You're
right.
Yeah, you just turned 15.
Right.
15
Correct.
Plus. And you're finishing high school, right?
I finished high school.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry. No. You're not finishing high school yet. You're 15
Right.
years old.
Right.
The war's over. The smoke is cleared, and 6 million Jews are dead. And there's issues in Palestine now with British, and this news is also getting to you, and of course.
I can remember a lot of it. I was aware, I think every Jew who was teenager or older was aware of what was going on. After all, World War II, keep in mind.
Were your brothers in the military?
Yeah. Well, I should mention that. My older brother, 4 years older, was in the Navy. Was a naval officer in World War II, and brilliant. He was a certified genius. He's still living, incidentally. He's 92 years old. And he was chosen as one of 15 people from the entire country to go to Columbia University and major in physics. A brilliant mind, and was trained as a physics major to work on the atomic bomb project. He eventually did work on the atomic bomb project and ended up as one of the first doctors in nuclear medicine.
And his name?
Gerald M. Lowenstein, and he and a partner built the first privately owned cyclotron on the West Coast. Cyclotron that created nuclear isotopes, because they were using, my brother used nuclear isotopes for diagnostic purposes as a physician in San Francisco.
And your other brother, was he in the service?
And my other brother, Jerry was 4 years older than I, right. And Murray was a year and a half older than I. So Murray and I were almost like twins in many ways. He was only 1 year ahead of me in school, but Murray served in the Army during the Korean War, and I served in the Army during the Korean War.
The Korean War, yeah.
Later. Now, after Israel.
After you got, yeah. So, how does your involvement begin with land and labor, or this whole? How does it begin? Where does it begin?
I can't remember a beginning. I only knew that I was very much aware of it, and I was a freshman at Columbia University, just a few miles from Flushing Meadows, where it's all going on. The New York newspapers were full of it, and I was very much aware.
So you're studying at Columbia University.
Yeah.
What's your major?
My major turned out to be international relations.
Okay. Wow.
But
when do you go to New York?
I went to New York I graduated from high school in 1947, and I entered Columbia University in the fall of '47.
And right after you...
And incidentally, I might add, getting ahead of the story a little bit, I turned out to be the only Columbia undergraduate who volunteered for the Israeli Army. Even though, probably 20% of the people at Columbia were Zionists, were Jews, and we had what was called the Youth Zionist Organization there. The Intercollegiate Zionist Organization, ITZFA it was called, Intercollegiate Zionist Federation chapter.
Now you enroll in the fall of 1947 at Columbia University. In November '47, the UN partitions Palestine.
Yes.
In New York.
Right, that's right. In November, I was there. I said, Flushing Meadows, where all the vote took place. All this was going on 3 or 4 miles, maybe 5 miles from where I was situated. And I was very much aware of what was going on. I mean, every Jew was. I believe. But I was especially because I definitely came from what would be called a Zionist home.
Are you recruited? How does it happen? How does it start?
Well, you know, I was a sensitive person, I think, and I was aware of what was going on, and I was really aware that soldiers, an army is made up of people, you know, not just people who are generals and everything, but it takes all kinds of people to make up an army. And Israel didn't have much of an army. There weren't that many people. There were only 600,000 Jews living in Palestine. And I looked at that many times. I thought about it. And I think I was pretty much aware that this was one of the most important events in the history of Judaism since the destruction of the Second Temple. And if the Jews lost this battle, it might be another 1,000 years.
So what do you do?
And so everybody, at some point, I mean, people thought, oh, I'm running away from home. You'd be surprised the ridiculous things that people thought about me. I was a very mature 17, and I knew exactly what I was doing the whole time. And I think I came to the conclusion that this is something that's worth risking my life for, because you don't think you're going to be committing suicide by doing something like this, but this was something of such importance that it was worth risking my life to do it.
How does it happen? Are you recruited on campus?
Yeah, it was the way it happened is this upperclassman who had been a friend of my brother's, because my brother had gone to Columbia also in the Navy, but in the naval program, because he was one of 15 chosen from the whole country to become physics majors. And this guy said, Ralph, in the spring of the year, I guess it must have been March or April, something like that, he said, I noticed on the bulletin board that the National Students Union has got a program that they're using an American ship that has been provided by the United States government to take youth hostelers, teachers who want to study abroad, and students who want to work in a British farm camps this summer over to England at a very low cost. I think a round-trip ticket was $200, maybe $100. It was a very low amount of money, subsidized by the U.S. government. And they were doing that in conjunction with the National Union of Students. They said, you ought to look at the bulletin board. It tells about this program. This may be a way of spending the summer over in England. You know, why don't you look into it? And his name was Paul Mishkin. He later became a professor at Columbia and University and what is the university in Berkeley, and in Berkeley, law school in Berkeley. And so I looked at it and asked my parents, to take $200 to do it, but they were willing to put up the money. They thought it would be a good experience for me. And I thought in the back of my head, maybe if I get over to England, I would be able to get to Israel. I thought, well, it's the kind of thing people think about. It'll never happen. Of course, I didn't share that with my parents. They would never have agreed to it. They turned out they were very, very upset at what I did, and they would never have agreed to that. But that was the opening. Just this guy telling me to look at the bulletin board and engage in this program. And so I applied for the program, and there were a Harvard guy, me, and 2 Vassar girls were accepted for this program to go to an international camp in England and work on the Westwick fruit farm up in the northern part of England. And so when the school year ended in June, of the first week of June, the next couple of days I was already on the ship called the Marine Tiger.
Now, is this June 48?
This was June 1948.
So Israel's already declared independence?
Oh, yeah, the war was on. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
The war was going on essentially since
November
the previous year, and Israel declared independence. So the fighting, but it became operative on May the 15th.
Right.
May the 15th.
Right.
And from the get-go, Israel was losing. And that was another very emotional thing. I mean, here I had applied for this program, but there was one defeat after the other. There were only 650,000 Jews in Palestine, and 5 Arab armies invaded. And so it was a one-sided battle.
So you head to England on this ship, right?
What I had, what?
You head to England.
I headed to England on the Marine Tiger. And I got to England, and we worked in the camp for a month. And then we were all given the opportunity to go to Europe for 10 days and then come back to Plymouth, England, and catch the same ship, the Marine Tiger, back to New York, which everybody else was going to do. The other 3 people were going to do, and others who, there were a lot of teachers who were going abroad that year. In other words, there weren't just us. There were a lot of Americans who were taking advantage of this United States ship getting these low rates to Europe. And so first I flew to Brussels, and then I went from Brussels to Paris. And then when I got to Paris, and I spoke no French at all. I majored in, I was taking German was my foreign language at Columbia. And I didn't know any French, not one word of French, but I knew the word for Jew was juif, J-U-I-F. And when I got to France, the first day I was there, and I was actually seeing sights along the way too, you know, while everything else was going on. I looked in the Paris phone book, and there were 2 listings under J-U-I-F, juif. And I went to the first one, and on the underground, that's what they call the subways then, and it turned out to be a kosher butcher shop. And I told him what I really wanted. I knew the Israeli embassy was being built. It hadn't opened yet. It was being built. And I asked him about where the embassy was, and he spoke English. It was, as I said, it was a kosher butcher, but mostly chickens were hanging up on spikes and everything else. And then I went to the Israeli embassy, which was still they were nailing things into the wall, but there was a secretary there. And I went to that desk, and I said, and she asked me what I wanted, and I said, I wanted to join the Israeli army. And she didn't say a word to me. She never said a word to me. She had a little pad in front of her, and she wrote down an address and handed it to me. Not one word passed between us. And I went to this address, and it was a little apartment off near the Arc de Triomphe, near where the Arc de Triomphe was. And I got to this apartment and rang the doorbell, and there were 2 young Israelis in there with sort of Haganah posters on the wall, and they interviewed me, and they wanted me to prove that I was Jewish. And so I recited the alphabet that convinced them I was Jewish. And I said, first of all, Lowenstein is a Jewish name. And they said, well, Lowenstein could be anything. That's exactly what they said. They were around 20 years old, 19 or 20. They're very young Israelis. And so they sent me to be examined by 3 doctors at different places, one for the chest, one for God knows what else. In other words, I went around to 3 doctors, and one of them was a woman doctor. And of course, they must have wondered why anybody my age. I mean, I actually was very tall, quite tall. I was 5'11". I was taller than most French people were. But still, I don't think I looked more than 17 years old. 18, I always looked very young for my age. In fact, I think I still look sort of young for my age. But anyway, I got back and I was accepted, and they took away my passport. And I trusted them completely, people I'd never seen before. they said, you have to give us your passport, which we will assure you that we will return to you whenever you get discharged from the Israeli army. And they gave me papers of a displaced person who was either living or dead, I'm not sure which, but for a Polish survivor of the Holocaust. And there were complete papers. His name was Zerich Itzkovich. And Zerich, I could hardly pronounce either name. And these were the papers that I was going to become that person from that point on. Keep going. And so 2 days later, I went to catch the train they told me where to go to catch a certain train for Marseille. They gave me the tickets to get to one-way tickets to Marseille, and they said there would be other people there that would be Americans there. When I got there, I've never forgotten how I identified them. Either there was another person that I could identify us, but anyway, there were 2 Americans there, and we introduced each other. The others at all were both veterans of the American Army, and I'll think of their names in a minute. My mind is going blank, but and they became very good friends, so I shouldn't forget that name. One was killed in Israel, and we took the train together to Marseille, which was about a 4 or 5 hour drive, and then we were met at Marseille by these Israelis in a small van, and they took us to a displaced persons camp.
Do you remember the name of the camp?
Yes, I do. I think it was Saint Jean or Saint something. I've got it written down. I've sort of forgotten now, because the place that I was sent to in Israel was also a very similar name. It was a British camp, but anyway, we went to this displaced persons camp, and at almost the same day the 3 of us got there, 25 Americans came over directly by ship, by French liner or whatever, to a French port, to whatever the French port was, and then they joined us in this displaced person camp. And all the other people were displaced persons, of course, people who had survived the Holocaust. Incidentally, mostly men. But a lot of people don't understand that there were very few women who survived the Holocaust. Very, very few women. The Germans took women usually and killed them right away. Very few women survived the initial transportation.
Yeah, the whole program.
And the women that really came into the DP camps were not slave labor camp survivors. They were people who were actually coming from places that the Germans hadn't caught them, either in Poland, Russia, or whatever. So
this is the first time you're actually seeing Holocaust survivors?
Very, very first time. In other words, we were like 28 people, but believe me, there were several hundred, 300 or 400 people there. We were just a small group.
Sure.
And so it was not a good experience, incidentally, obviously. Even the displaced persons camp is very primitive. We slept on what I thought were bad beds, but it was going to get worse than that. There were beds that had the springs in them, but no mattresses at all. You just slept on the springs, and you had to sleep on whatever you had. You slept in your clothes and everything else, and the meals, the displaced persons were really primitive in a way. They had been used to not getting any food, not having a human existence. Not much has been written about this.
They were treated as subhumans.
Well, you think, so, if you think about Elie Wiesel and others, you think these geniuses came out of there.
No.
These were people who were survivors. I mean, the nice people didn't survive the Holocaust for the most part. These were people who was dog eat dog.
Yeah.
And we had to line up for our meals, which were decent food, I mean, it wasn't bad food. Fights erupted every time we lined up. People were fighting about who gotten in line ahead of them, places in line. That was just a constant battle of people fighting each other.
How did that affect you?
It affected me, not adversely, but it affected my knowledge to see that Israel, people don't really understand Israel. I mean, in many ways, Israel had to take a huge population of people and make them human beings again, largely. And Israel is never given credit for that, not a bit of credit, because it is really written about. But all these people who were just descended, had descended into a dog-eat-dog life. A hell, had to become human beings again. And we Americans expected Israel, we didn't expect to make them human beings again, but Israel really had to take these people and make them productive citizens again. And I forgive Israel for many, many things that a lot of people don't forgive them for, because they were able to do it. They were able to do it. And anyway, so we thought a few of the people who were pilots, there were a couple of pilots among aircraft pilots, and they were taken right away and flown to Czechoslovakia.
Operation Velveeta.
Because they needed them badly. But the rest of us, and actually I was one of the few that didn't have American, almost nobody. In fact, there were none in my group. Of this group of 28, I was the only one that had not served in World War II. We had 5 women who had been nurses and other people who had skills. Israel, for the most part, was recruiting people between the ages of 22 and 26. And they wanted people who had World War II experience. I'm saying there must have been Americans, many, who wanted to do what I did. But Israel really wasn't taking people, generally speaking, at that point, from college. They were desperate. They were taking people who had military skills and could be used quite quickly. So anyway, Frank Perlman was the name of one of them. The other one is on a museum thing. I'll think of his name in a minute. He was killed in the attack on Beersheba. But the 3 of us became very close friends. Frank sort of adopted me. Frank was 10 years older than I. He was 28. Yeah. And he had served in Japan, in the Pacific and in Japan, and spoke Japanese, and took me under his wing. And so anyway, the 5-day trip on the Pan York.
What was the name of the ship?
The ship was the Pan York.
The Pan York.
And this was the most, if I'm speaking too long, tell me.
No. The Pan York?
Pan York, Y-O-R-K.
And it left Marseille?
The Pan York was 5 days on the Pan York. It left 10 days. 10 days after I got there, the Pan York left not from the main port in Marseille, but another small port near Marseille, Port or something. Okay. And it had a sister ship called the Pan Crescent. The Pan Crescent and the Pan York were Panamanian fruit ships that had been taken to a port in Europe. I've forgotten the name of it now, and completely rebuilt on the inside. In other words, they were both Central American banana boats, and they were made to haul bananas. Each one could carry a crew of 13 people, and it was equipped to carry only 13 human beings. And they put aboard the Pan York, this trip, 1,700 people. But the first trip of the Pan York and the Pan Crescent, the British let them, I think, go directly to Cyprus, because there were so many people. It was 7,000 people. If you can imagine,
these are huge ships.
You can't imagine 7,000 people on a ship that is built to carry a crew of 13. That meant there were bathrooms and showers for 13 men, not even women, because there was no unit. There were no 2 sexes, so you only needed 1 bathroom for 13 people, and 1 one of everything. And what they had done in these two ships, well, the Pan York is the one that I was on. It was there, and this was the second voyage of the Pan York. The first one, 7,000 people went directly to Cyprus. The people were unloaded. It came back to Haifa, I suppose, and then it came over to Marseille, bringing in displaced persons. And they put what did I say was it? They put 1,700 people. In other words, they emptied the DP camp, emptied it, and so I can remember my parents still didn't know. I was writing them letters like I was sightseeing in Paris, and I wrote them a letter telling them where I was going to go. There was no such thing really as phones, or even telegrams almost in those days. Yeah. But anyway, and I wouldn't have telephoned them anyway because I knew they would try to stop me. Right. But I can remember dropping the letter into a mailbox, and then shortly, a few minutes afterwards, going in, stepping aboard the gangplank into the Pan York, which was like the gangplank to hell. I mean, if I look back at my entire life of now 88 years, it's going to be 89 so shortly, there are no 5 days that are comparable to the 5 days aboard the Pan York. It was like living in hell, absolute hell for 5 days. They had taken the holds of the ship that held bananas, and they had built, I think there were like three holes going down 3 stories, like there were 3 stories, the bottom, two stories above that, 2 floors. And in each level, they had built 3 levels of boards of shelving. Like if you'd go into a big grocery store.
Like in the concentration camps.
Like you'd go into the grocery store and there was nothing, there was just shelves there. And the shelves were 5.5 feet deep. And I was 5'11", keep in mind. And they were all lined up. There was one bulb on the ceiling, one light bulb in the ceiling. And we could take whichever level we want, wherever we wanted. No mattresses, no blankets, nothing else. We were sleeping in our clothes for 5 days. And there was no dining room at all. And in fact, if the French had known what was really going on the ship, they would never have let it leave port. That's why it didn't leave a main port. There were like, I'd say 6 life rafts, 6 lifeboats. Maybe there were 8. But there were no more than 8. There are pictures of it for 1,500 people, and I often wondered on that trip, what if an Egyptian ship had come across and torpedoed us or something like this? Nobody would have survived because, and if there were life vests, they didn't tell us about it because I never saw a life vest either. And there may have been some life rafts. I would be surprised if there weren't. So I don't remember correctly. But
was the crew Israeli?
What?
Was the crew Israeli?
No. There were probably people who were in Aliyah who were doing that. I really don't recall it all. It'd be easy to find out. Okay. But there were Israeli leaders. There were really young, very, very bright people because they had to really run the ship, just like they ran the DP camp. The Israelis did run the DP camp. Again, young people for the most part. And of course, they had to load aboard this ship enough food to serve. It would take 5 days to serve people for 5 days. There were no mess, take my word for it, there were no mess trays, mess tins, nothing like that. You got like hardtack and something and sardines for breakfast. You got something else and sardines for lunch and something else and sardines for supper. I've never eaten another sardine since I left the Pan York. It was just god-awful.
What date do you sail on? Do you remember the date of?
I arrived there on August the 14th, 1948. And so if you
in
Haifa. So if you subtract 5 days from that, you'll see what it was.
August 8th.
And I tell people this, though, and when you had to sleep, and it was hot, they had periscopes. When they had refitted this boat, they put these like periscopes on the deck. Let's say there were 7 or 10 periscopes, looking like periscopes, but there was like a fan, exhaust fan at the bottom that they were trying to draw in air and take it into the hole. Otherwise, we would have smothered. And but the only thing is, this was August in the Mediterranean. What they were drawing in was almost as hot as it could possibly be. So you were just constantly sweating. It was just sweat running down you. And the toilets, there were no toilets. So this is I'm laughing when I say this. I wasn't laughing then, but on each side of the boat, they built like an outhouse. If you extended it, I call them 10 holes. There was 10 holes, a piece of lumber with 10 holes in it, and then it was cantilevered out over the water. In other words, if you crapped or peed, it went directly into the water because there was no running water.
Right.
And on the deck, they had one basin outside of each for these latrines that ran only salt water. They didn't have enough water for people, just enough water for people to drink is all they had for 5 days. And they could give you water to drink, and not much of that. But if you wanted to wash, it had to be with salt water. And so there was this running salt water, and in the latrines themselves, no running water. So they would take crews of those Americans, really, that they considered more civilized, and we would take fire hoses twice a day and wash out the latrines, because the latrines
with seawater.
With seawater. And then if any splashed on any of the displaced persons, they would want to get in a fight with us for getting like crap on them or something like that. There was not a great deal of friendship between the displaced persons. You think, oh, we're carrying on conversation. First of all, they only spoke Yiddish and whatever, Russian or whatever they might have been speaking. And some of the people, Frank Perlman spoke Yiddish fluently, and he could speak to them. But my German wasn't good enough to really carry on a conversation with them. And the truth of the matter is, they were not people that you would want to associate with. I'm saying this is what they were. It wasn't like.
Hold on a sec. Let me just turn this off.
I'm trying to think of
Hold on a sec. It's my mother. I'm just answering for. Hold on a second.
Have you ever interviewed anybody like me before?
What's that?
Have you ever interviewed anybody like me before?
Of course. So what were you telling me about the whole? Sorry, my mother called. I had to take that phone call. Right?
Yeah.
You understand?
I'll let you get started again.
Wait a sec. Okay.
There were some people who had married in the DP camps, and they had small babies, actually. There were babies. This was one of the first ships that left from Europe with whole families, babies, children, and everything else. And so essentially, they didn't think children would survive the heat down in the holes, even with this air wafting in. So they put, when you get to my house, you'll see a picture of it, but they strung army blankets between the masts to give shades, and women with babies and very small children could sleep on the deck, not in the hold.
Right.
So they could get fresh, at least get fresh air. So that was really provided for them. So there were not only people stuffed into the holes, but the whole deck was full of people sleeping, living, and everything else like that. And so I say that sometimes when I speak to people, I say, now this is going to be somewhat indelicate, but I have to talk about the latrines. And I said, there were 10 holers, and there were like 3 for men and 3 for women. But the first time I had to defecate, I went into one of them, and I pulled down my pants, and I didn't dare touch the surface of the wood. So I just squatted down, and this little old lady, about 60 years old, came, even though this was for men, she didn't understand, could read it or whatever. So she came in, hopped up on the bench, on the hole next to mine, pulled down her pants and started doing something. And I said, I pulled up my pants and left. And I went for 5 days without defecating. And I said, you think it's impossible to go 5 days without moving your bowels? I said, take my word for it, it is possible. I said, I only peed once in 5 days. I peed once, and that was when late at night I went to the back deck and peed into the ocean. I said, I peed once and defecated none in 5 days. It's entirely possible for this to happen, especially if you're not taking in very much food. It was an awful, miserable, horrible experience. And not only that, you're thinking, what have I gotten myself into? You know, and what if we were hugging the coast? We were hugging the coast of Europe. In other words, they weren't going the shortest way to Haifa. They were hugging the coast all the way until they got to Greece, Cyprus, whatever. It's the closest way, and then they headed across to Haifa because they didn't want to encounter any Egyptian or any of the other countries are hostile. Yeah. And so this is what everybody was up against. And it was, and once you got to Israel, everything was easy. I mean, basically, no matter what they did, what kind of food you got, where you slept, God, it was nothing like the Penn York. Penn York was the most horrible experience of my entire life. And in fact, it was sort of funny, when I got to this camp named St. Jean, this was a former British base that they used to train people to fly Piper Cubs and light aircraft. It was up near, you know where Bustan HaGalil is? It's up above Haifa. Okay. It's a moshav. Okay. It's right on the ocean front, okay. But it's right below Nahariya. You're almost at Nahariya, and there's this base called St. Jean. Okay. And they had Quonset hut. If you pass it, you'll see it's the main road to Nahariya, and there were a series of 7 to 8 Quonset huts. And these are what. And
is this where they took you guys?
No, they didn't. They took us to Telodvinsky.
So you get off the boat?
We got off the boat. What happened was, that was not the end of it. We arrived on August the 14th. I can't remember whether it was in the night or the I guess during the late afternoon, let's say. I don't have a good memory about that. And they said, now look, there are going to be UN observers at the gangplanks, and they're going to be interviewing everybody to make sure there are no foreign volunteers. See, and not only did they get the shit end of the stick, but then there were UN observers sitting there waiting to catch you and deport you or God knows what else if you didn't speak Yiddish, and most of us didn't really speak Yiddish and everything. And they were worried that we weren't going to pass muster. We weren't going to get off that ship. And it occurred to me for the first time, and that's one thing that has sustained me all my life about love for Israel. And I always defend Israel no matter what. And that is, who would be asked, what other country would be asked to put up with this kind of crap? In other words, that was a country that belonged to us, that they were taken, they had 5 enemies coming from every direction, and the United Nations was standing there keeping volunteers from coming in, whereas they knew that in all the borders, the Egyptian border, the Jordanian border, Lebanese, Syrian troops, there were no UN observers there. They were coming in with tanks and military stuff, and they were checking people coming off of this stupid ship, you know? I mean, if you even write about it, it sounds like it's wonderland, that you don't know what the hell you're writing.
It's bias.
Yeah, but that was it. Israel was getting the dirty end of the stick from the get-go, and Israel. And I see these Americans, young people today. I like to get to them and talk to them, who belong in BDS and all the other stuff, and Palestine rights. They're always worried about the rights of the Palestinians, and they have no idea of the birth pangs of this country and what they did and how many thousands of people they lost because of this kind of crap getting the shitty end of the stick. And they are American Jews. I can understand non-Jews not understanding anything else. I cannot comprehend any American Jew who has half a mind to read and read history to understand how they can be opponents of Israel under any circumstances. And that story doesn't get through to these kids by their own parents, or even by people like me, because if you get Jewish centers where they teach, they don't teach about the Pan New York, believe me. You know, I've been here for 40 years. I've lived here for 40 years. Everybody in town knows me. I'm actually one of the more famous people in town because I founded the NPR station. People do like me and know me, and I like most of them. And they know my background. They know I'm a veteran of the Israeli army. People know that about me, and I'm active in, you know, many associate.
Don't play with that.
Oh, sorry, that's yours. Excuse me. And we have a Center for Jewish Studies. Do you know how many times I've been asked to speak to any class at the Center of Jewish Studies in 40 years? One time. I've never been asked to speak but one time at any class at the Center for Jewish Studies. And I've never said it, maybe I'm telling you, I've never said anything about it, but this annoys me. I mean, I'm the only person in town who has been through this particular experience, who is an American who volunteered for the Army, who went through this displaced person experience. And here are all these young people coming through, and they're mostly Jews in their classes, and I'm the last person they would think of to come in. Sometimes at our synagogue, I'm invited to speak to teenage kids, and they're very. I don't speak about all this, but they're very responsive because they can identify with me, especially the driving. See, when I got to Israel, into the induction camp, Televinsky, I'm moving ahead to that. I mean, the first thing we were doing, they stopped at a kibbutz, I know the name of it, on the way to Tel Aviv. I'll think of it in a minute. And we were allowed to go to a real bathroom and move our bowels and take a shower, take a hot shower. The first shower in 5 days, you must have stank to beat the band.
And this is all the 25 of you guys, right?
28 of us. Uh-huh. And then he took us to Televinsky. And I thought, well, you know, all these other people have been in the Army, nurses, this or that. Do you know that I had something that I had that almost none of them had, that they needed right away? I had been driving a car since the age of 13. In Virginia, you could learn to drive at 13, and you could get your license at 14. I had been driving for 5 years. I had been driving for 5 years. Nothing big like trucks and all, but stick shifts. You know, stick shift. Sure. This was before automatic drive, and so they took me right away and sent me to this camp near Nahariya that was called the 79th Armored. It was an armored unit without any tanks. It had half tracks. 10-ton vehicles that they had bought surplus. They bought 200 of them, I think, in Europe as surplus, and tried to convince the UN and others, the British, that they could be used as tractors on kibbutzim because they had tracks in the back and everything. And so they were able to unload them, and for the most part. And so they took me and taught me how to drive, because I knew how to drive, but they weigh 10 tons. There are actually eight forwards. There are actually 8 forward gears and 2 reverses. You have that ability, and there was no power. There was no power on them.
So, no power steering.
No power brakes. Forget the steering. No power steering. No power brakes. So if you're going along at that top speed, say 35, maybe 40 miles an hour top speed, but if you start slowing down, you could push on the brake pedal. Nothing was going to happen. You're not going to stop 10 tons. They weigh 10 tons. You're not going to stop 10 tons of steel.
So they're training you how to drive this?
Yeah, but you can only drive it stop by downshifting, which you don't have to do on an American car, even a stick shift. You know, they automatically shift. But you have to goose up the speed so the gears will mesh. You know, it's called downshifting. You had to be taught. That wasn't that hard to do, but you had to be taught to do that. And they have different speeds and off-road, you know, driving. And so they quickly taught me to drive that, and I went into combat the first time 5 days later.
Wow. Where?
It was just a patrol at night.
Where?
In the Galilee.
In the Galilee?
In Galilee. It was not a village or anything else. My Bulgarian corporal said, "Well, Ralph, we're going on patrol tonight." And I wasn't driving the vehicle that night. He said, this was at the 3rd or 4th day I was there. And he said, we're going out to, well, no, it was 10 days after I'd gotten to the country. He said, we're going out on patrol. There's a unit that is surrounded, a patrol, just a few men who are surrounded in a certain place, and they're sending us out to rescue them, to bring them back. And so we went into someplace in the Galilee, and we headed towards this place, and we got right near where the men were located, and all of a sudden these bullets started. It was at night. It was night. These bullets started coming down from the hills. I was in Israel 10 days, and somebody was trying to kill me.
Welcome to the Holy Land.
And I wasn't even driving. I was in the back of the half track, and the half track is open on the top. You know, the sides are really steel this thick, but they're open on the top. Even the driver is open on the top, and you wonder, well, my God, this is my day to get it. But so it was a very good experience, huh?
Did you rescue you?
Yeah, we rescued the men. And we were with 3 armored cars. They sent, I think, 2 half tracks and 3 armored cars. And the armored cars were made in Israel also. They take what's called a command carrier, or I forgot what it was called, but they built metal. The Israelis themselves put metal surroundings in an opening for a submachine gun.
Sure. So where else are you?
It didn't carry cannon.
So where are you located in the Israeli army?
Okay, for the most part, we were this was the only armored unit in the northern part of the country. That's a thing to remember. All the armor was against the best fighters, the Egyptians and the Jordanians.
Yeah.
We were fighting the Syrians, the Lebanese, and the Iraqis, who were the worst fighters. But they had artillery. We didn't have any artillery. They had good stuff, but they were lousy fighters. And so they could keep this one armored unit there. Yigal Allon was once the commander of this unit. So it's a very famous unit in the Israeli army. It's a very famous, Shavim V'Tesha. It's a very famous unit in the Israeli army, and it wasn't then. And so anything that happened from Nahariya over to the Lake of Kinneret, over there, all the way down to I've forgotten what was that, but anyway, the whole northern part of the country, and we didn't possess the whole Galilee. Later on, my unit was the spearhead unit to get the Galilee, to capture the Galilee. Haram, they call it battle, the Operation Haram, and we stayed on Mount Sinai. We spent 2 nights on Mount Sinai.
Sinai?
Not Mount Sinai, Mount. Oh my God.
Gilboa?
No, near Tzfat, the mountain near Tzfat. Hill, the big hill near Tzfat. It's a biblical. Sion. It was Har Sion, not Har Sion. That's in Jerusalem too. What is the mountain next to Tzfat?
The mountain next to Tzfat?
It's like my own name. Canaan. I think it's Har Canaan. I think it's Har Canaan. Is that right? Next to Tzfat is Har Canaan. Go to Har.
Hiram? That's
What?
the Mifza, that's the operation, Hiram.
Hiram was the name of the action.
Yeah.
But Canaan is
Is it near Carmel?
No, Carmel is Haifa. This was, I'm pretty sure it's Har Canaan, Mount Canaan.
Mount Meron?
No, Mount Canaan.
Canaan? Near Tzfat? Okay, but it's near Tzfat. I can't find it right now.
I'm pretty sure it's Mount Canaan.
Okay. So most of the time...
And so we spent 2 or 3 nights there preparing for the action to take the rest of the Galilee. And my unit actually spearheaded that action. But there were a lot of other units in there, but many men in Machal, the Machal units, that we helped take the rest of, and actually we thought we would be going for the Jordanians, and I still think maybe they really should have. It would have stopped, it would have saved a lot of lives in the long run, but Ben-Gurion turned thumbs down on that. The commanders wanted to keep going after we had taken everything up to the Lebanese border, you know, and the Syrian borders, because we didn't take the Golan Heights then. We didn't have the Golan Heights.
No.
But we could have easily then, they were running so fast. They were running so fast that they were hardly putting up a fight. And we could have just steered over to the central. The Jordanians had the best troops.
Right.
And lots of people would have gotten killed. But at that point, they could have taken up to the Jordan River, and I think they could have done it. But I think Ben-Gurion was afraid that Britain would come into the war. You see, Britain had 80,000 troops in Egypt.
Did they really?
Maybe they had.
I'm just looking for the name of the operation, but continue. Please.
I think it was Hiram. I think it's H-I-R.
Mifza Hiram. I'm looking for a second. Mifza Hiram. Hold on.
Hiram. I think they called it.
Mifza Hiram.
I think that was it.
Yep. Here we go. Mifza Hiram.
Yeah.
It started on the 28th of October.
That's right.
1948.
That's right.
And it ended on the 31st of October. So
That's
4 days.
That's right.
Yep.
And we came back.
And we have here Chativat Sheva, Chativat Tesha, Chativat Carmeli, Chativat Golani.
Shivim Vatesha, yeah.
It doesn't say Shivim Vatesha here.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was the 7th Brigade.
Yeah, Chativat Sheva.
Yeah, but our unit in the 7th Brigade
it says
was
here,
called Shivim Vatesha, 79th, and it's still one of the most famous armored units in the Israeli army. They were the ones that.
So
if you look up in the 79th Armored, you will see lots about them.
What about here? It says Operation Hiram was a military operation conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces during the 1948 war. It was led by General Moshe Carmel.
Right.
And aimed at capturing the Upper Galilee region from the Arab Liberation Army forces led by Fawzi el-Kawaldi and the Syrian Battalion. And the Syrian Battalion...
we were fighting Iraqis also. in Lebanon, Iraqis and Lebanese.
Arabs, it is a Syria, Lebanon, and the Arab Liberation Army,
Right.
which was Arab guys from the local Galilee.
Yeah, right.
They
That's
had their
right.
own- they
That's
had their
right.
own,
That's
They
right.
had their own.
But they were really awful.
But there were also Druze fighting with you guys.
Yeah, right. But the Arabs were awful
Yeah, you
fighters.
said that they were just,
They're horrible fighters.
They were just, completely.
But we captured artillery pieces from them and then sent back to wherever and brought in people who knew how to operate artillery and used the artillery against them the next day.
Now, after this operation, what goes on? What's happening with you? Like,
What happened? We go back. We go back and nothing much happens. And then they moved us from St. Jean to a camp right below Nahariya, a tent camp. It was only a tent camp, and we never went into. The only thing we did was we accompanied. Well, you see, there was very little fighting after that. The only fighting was in the Negev.
In the Negev,
In
yeah,
Negev.
yeah. And
And they
Jerusalem.
couldn't do that.
And Jerusalem.
Yeah, but they couldn't. They had to keep one armored unit
course.
in
Had
the
to keep
north.
it up there, yeah.
In
Yeah.
the north. So,
Yeah.
so basically, they used us to set up
Stabilize.
kibbutzim. No,
Really?
when people were going out and taking these newly
Which-
captured territories
yeah.
and
Which
putting up
kibbutzes?
kibbutzim
Yeah,
and moshavim,
Sa'ad.
then we would go in and protect them the first few days.
Wow.
And then I left on December the 24th.
Back to the
Yeah.
United States. How
But my unit never went into combat
so what did
again.
you just say to them? I had enough. I'm going home.
No, they gave everybody who was a student in college, and there were very few of us, an opportunity to be discharged to get home in time for the spring semester. So I only lost one semester of college. I went in the summers and graduated with my class. Most of my classmates did not even know I'd been gone. But I graduated with the same class I came in with. I went to
So
in the
here's the
summers.
question that I have to ask you. What do your parents say?
Oh, it'll take me most feeling you've got.
What happened?
Well, my mother.
How did they find out?
Well, when they got that letter from me.
Right.
When they got the letter from me, and you see, we were given an address of the American and Canadian Club, and I've forgotten the name of it, in Tel Aviv.
Higher Con.
Yeah,
Higher country. There was a Machal there.
we could not get letters directly because the fiction was that we were not there. In other words, so all that mail, I didn't get even mail for weeks and weeks.
Months.
Well, certainly many. Because it had to come, But my mother was outraged, and the first thing she did is she got my father. My brother was working. One is a genius, He was working for the atomic scientist organization in Washington at that time, and so the first thing Mother did was demand to see the ambassador, Elihu Alat, who was the ambassador to from Israel to the United States. Elihu Alat, his name before was Epstein. His name was Elihu Epstein, was the first ambassador from Israel to the United States.
In Washington?
In Washington. He changed his name to Elat. And so Mother was a Zionist, and she had all these friends. So Mother demanded that she and my father be allowed to see the ambassador, not an underling, but the ambassador, and demand that I was underage, that I should be shipped back, and all this other stuff. And so they went, and my brother was the one who told my mother. And they went in to see Elihu a lot, and he listened to him. He said, Mrs. Lowenstein, if your son wants to come back, he said, I will do my best to see that he is shipped back. But when I was his age, living in Turkey, I did the exact same thing. And he said, unless he asked, he said he's almost 18 years old. No, he's 17. I was 18 years old. He said he's 18 years old. He's 18 years old, and he's got a mind of his own. and unless he wants to come back, we're not going to force him to come back. And so my mother wrote letters begging me to come back and everything else like that. And very, very upsetting letters. And so my corporal, who was named Marco Confino, he was a Bulgarian Jew, really a very nice guy, but sort of a swashbuckler and everything. And he said, Ralph, he said, my advice is for you to write your mother and tell her that you will write her every week, but if she's going to send letters like this, it destroys your morale never to write you again. Just tell her, don't mail any letters.
The letters were so harsh?
Yeah, how could I do this to her and to the family? And your mother never reconciled herself to it. And so I wrote back and she essentially said, Mother, you know, it's hard for me to do my work here with these letters that you're sending. And I want to see the letters to see how you and Dad are doing and everything. But if this is all you can write, don't write me any more letters. I'll promise you I'll write you every week, but don't write me any more letters. And so I didn't hear from her for about 6 weeks. And then letters started coming in, and she didn't mention it again.
And when she finally saw you?
She was happy. I don't think she ever forgave me. I don't think my mother ever forgave me for doing it. In a way, she was sort of proud of me, you know. I think she would say, well, my son served in the Israeli army. But my mother always thought that she actually thought that some black bearded Zionist rabbi in Paris had caught me and convinced me to join the army. She never believed that I myself had made this decision. I mean, keep in mind that Columbia, there were 3 Columbia students who participated. And I'm the archivist, so I know I have all the data, documents and everything. One was a law student who flew plane, who had been a pilot of B-17s, and he helped fly aircraft to Czechoslovakia, but only while he's out of law school. Then he went back to law school, you know. The other one was a law student, and one was a Christian master student who was a Christian, and actually made his life there, married an Israeli girl and still living there, he's still alive. And he was a master student. But of the undergraduates at Columbia, I was the only undergraduate. In Harvard, I think there were 4, maybe 5 from Harvard and from no other Ivy League school. There was not another another volunteer from any Ivy League school. And I was in Columbia, had a lot of Jewish students. I was the only one. But in fairness to them, it was, look what I went through. In other words, it was very difficult. It was not easy to get out of the country. And our passports, as you'll see in the museum, if you look at it.
How did you ever get your passport back?
Yeah.
At the end?
Right.
Yeah.
I left, I'll complete the story. I was discharged on December the 24th, 1948, and came back on the Marine Carp. And just before I got aboard the ship that day, they handed me my passport. Perfectly the way it was before. The only thing is that I entered France as Ralph Lowenstein, and I exited France as Zerich Ichkovich. My passport showed that I had entered France, but that I had never left France. And this was going to show me that I was leaving Israel and entering the United States, but I did not ever get to Israel legally. So the way they handle that is they put, I can show you when we get home, they put a piece of paper in that gave me a supplementary visa with my picture and my name, stuff in Hebrew, and that allowed me to get aboard the Marine Carp, and when I thought, well, it's just going to hit the fan when I get to New York, and there were 4 of us who had been discharged, but the others didn't have the problems that I had. They'd been, I don't know what they did with them, but they didn't seem to have my problems. But they knew, well, I think they had the same problems, I'm going to think of it. And we were saying, okay, now what's going to happen when we get to New York City? They sent, in those days, they probably still do, they would send an immigration official to the ship while it was still in the harbor, still at the Statue of Liberty, say, while it was still puttering into the dock. And they'd send him out, they would send him out, not make you go get down off the ship and go through immigration. They would send a person out to check to check the passports while you were still at sea. Do you follow me? Mm-hmm. And so this guy took my passport. He looked at me, looked at the picture in the front of the passport, flipped to the back of the last page of the passport. Now I didn't show him the temporary visa I had. Went to the back page of the passport and stamped it, entry. They knew that the 5 or 6 of us were on the ship, and they had orders not to give us any problems. And my mother was at dockside waiting for me with my aunt, one of her sisters. They had come up to New York to get me.
Ralph,
I went back to Columbia. I missed 1 semester of Columbia. As I said, I made it up completely in the summers and graduated with my class.
we're going to take a break right now.
Okay.
Hold on. Okay, so we're doing the second part of our interview.
Okay.
And
I charge extra for that.
do you? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know. Ralph, explain to me about the work that you've been doing about documenting, archiving American and Canadian members of Machal.
Yeah. Well, I thought, did I say that to you earlier this morning?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Just,
I had the idea some years ago, quite a few years ago, as a matter of fact, that there were just not that many people, maybe 1,000 or so people, and that we were going to all get old someday. You know, they wouldn't be even around for people to interview, and nobody knew anything about them. If you'd ask anybody if they've ever met anybody who served in the Israeli army, an American in 1948, the chances thousands to 1 against ever meeting anybody. In my case, for example, strangely enough, I have never met one person. Of course, I'm not in New York or places like that, but I've never met one person who ever found out that I served in the Israeli army in 1948 who had met anybody else who had done it. If you take a look at the fact that there's something like 5 or 6 million Jews in this country, and there are only like 1,500 people who served, the odds against knowing more than anybody who had ever done it. And so I thought that for reasons of posterity and of relations between Israel and the United States, and a lot of other factors, that we should know who these people were, where they came from, and what their motivations were. And at the end of the questionnaire, I asked them, why did you do it? Has Israel today, I've forgotten what the year was, I sent it to him.
92, 91?
Yeah, and I'd ask him, has Israel today fulfilled your expectations? And it's interesting what a lot of the people say.
And how long did you do this for?
Years. I had the idea, and then it just sort of mushroomed. I got the list from the American Veterans of Israel. They had a membership list. And then we tried to find other people who weren't on the membership list, you know, who had never done it, that we knew had served. And every now and then, for a few years after, we'd begin discovering new people. The thing is that we didn't know 9/10 of the people ourselves. It wasn't like we all went and served in one unit. The Israelis separated us, except for one unit, which was called the 72nd, I believe. That was all English speaking, and that turned out to be a huge mistake, because all speaking English, they thought that everybody else was out to screw them. You know, they complained about the Israelis and everything else.
Was this the unit that Tom Tugan was in?
Yeah, I think so.
An anti-tank unit, right?
No, he was in a different unit. Many of us were in different units, like the 79th just had really a handful of Americans.
That's what you were in?
Yeah, I was in. And in fact, I was so ticked off at that a lot of the Americans that I went over with, and their gripes about Israelis, about displaced persons and everything else, that I didn't even want to serve with them, a lot of them. So basically, I was happy to be in a unit which is essentially an Israeli unit. It turns out that most of the people were really pretty nice. It was my mistake. I just didn't get to know. I didn't get to know the nice ones, of whom there were, I'd say, 99% were really very nice people.
Now about the Mahal, you know, is there anything that you found out while you were gathering all this information about Mahal that you didn't know?
No, that's just how widespread the units that they served in. They served in almost every unit. There was almost no unit, because the Israelis weren't trying to segregate, except in that one thing, the 72nd. That was the only one they did that. And as I said, it became a big mistake, because all the guys that spoke English were against everybody else who didn't speak English. You know, it was a sort of a thing that it was better to integrate us with all the Hebrew-speaking people and speaking other languages. So in my unit, there were probably more South Africans than there were Americans.
Really? And what can you tell me about? Okay, so I know that in your research you mostly focused only on American and Canadian volunteers.
Right, that's right.
What can you tell me about the Canadian volunteers?
That there is virtually no difference in any way between Canada and the United States. In other words, it's a Canadian and an American not only speak the same language, they think alike, they had the same customs, generally speaking. It's totally different than, let's say, an American and a South African. It's, I think of Canadians and Americans as just one people, the Jews as one people. And I think they do too. There was no division between us. We came from the same type of families, the same aims in life.
Smoked meat.
Everything.
Baseball.
I guess Canadians are like that, except for the French-speaking Canadians. The Canadians are like that. There's no difference between them and Americans.
So, in what year did you give all of your data to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York?
American Jewish Historical Society. I'd have to do research on that and go back to you. But I would imagine I'm going to guess, because I did it after I retired from the faculty. I started collecting the stuff long before I retired. But when I retired, I had to find the time to get those 2 years of work in. And I retired in 1994, I think. So it would have been, I would guess, 1995, 96, something like that.
And how much material did you have to give them?
Well, they wanted everything that I could get. The questionnaires was different than, I got a lot of stuff, pictures, photographs, I said memoirs. One guy, people started sending me stuff that they had. One guy had the idea of going around taping everybody and then interviewing them. He was going to do a book on it or something like that. And they're mostly Air Force people, almost all Air Force people. And so he went around taping all these people. And he sent me this, and then he decided he was going to die, or he was sick of doing it or whatever. He sent me the boxes of tapes, of the old type of tapes and everything. And that still hasn't been translated. In other words, I sent it up to them, but it would cost a fortune to get anybody to listen to those things and translate it. It's in English, but
transcript. What other kind of gems did you have in your collection?
Well, a lot of photographs, tremendous number of photographs, and a couple of diaries that people had done. And we had some books on the subject that they may not have had that we sent to them and everything. I tried to get almost every book that had been written about it. I have them in my library today. I've got a tremendous library on the War of Independence. I think I got virtually every book that has been written on the War of Independence and most of the wars I'll show you in the war since then.
I got a creative question to ask you. You're a journalist. You're the dean of the journalistic faculty here at Florida State for 18 years.
Right.
I'm sure besides having a very...
And one of the few Jewish deans in the country.
I have a creative question, and it might take a little time for you to answer it. If you could pick 3 characters who were in Mahal, you're writing a feature film script right now, okay? You're a script writer, and you got to pick 3 characters that you think that through their stories, you can write a feature film script, and each story it's on its own. You understand? It's 3 stories that are. Which guys would you pick, or ladies?
I wouldn't have any idea. Wow. I wrote a novel. Do you know I wrote a novel?
No.
About the War of Independence?
No.
I did. It did not. But I wrote a novel about it, and I think it was a pretty good one. But all kinds of things went wrong.
What's the name of it?
Bring My Sons from Far. I'll give you a copy, paperback copy before you leave.
I appreciate that.
Actually, I worked for 7 years on it. It was one of the.
Tell me a little bit about it.
Heartbreaking. I had this idea for the novel, and I worked for 7 years on it, writing and rewriting. If you're a teacher, not an administrator, I was a teacher for 20 years, and then an administrator for 20 years, and. We would get off in the summer, not the summer, like I only teach one summer session. So the other summer session, I had the full day to work with. And when we lived in El Paso, and I taught at the University of Texas at El Paso, and so I had this idea for the novel, and I would go down at 7 o'clock in the morning. Another faculty member was on vacation, not in my department, but a good friend, and he gave me his office. And I would leave at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would work until 4:30 every day, from 7 to 4:30 every day, working on this novel. And I did that for 2 or 3 summers. And I had a good friend who didn't get an agent. No, one of the best agents in the country wrote me and said it's the best, one of the best first novels that he had ever read, but there was no market for a novel about this subject at that time. In other words, about the Israeli War of Independence. And then 2 years later, what's his name's book, we just mentioned it, the best-selling book on Israel.
Exodus?
Exodus came out 2 years later, and that did very, very well. I'm not trying to compare mine to that, but he was saying there was no market for a book about this subject.
What year was this? When you were writing this?
Well, as you was finding with eggs, I would say it would be around 19. I have to think of 48, 58, or around in the mid 50s, 1950s.
So the memories are still fresh.
Yeah, still fresh, and some of them are based on people I knew. And the hero, the hero was me, of course. You know, somebody like me. But I had to make myself older. Nobody would believe that anybody 18 years old could have a love interest, etc. And it was older, and but it came from a small southern town, and some of these things were the same. But I still think it's a very, very good novel. In fact, it got a good review in the Kansas City Star and the Washington Post reviewed it. It got 90-some reviews. But what happened with it was absolutely heartbreaking. It's just one of those things. You get a good novel and you spent many of the good years of your life and lonely and writing stuff. I'd never written fiction before. And what happened was, I have to show you the book to make you believe it, but World Publishing, finally, I would send it to people and they would reject it. But World Publishing Company, I can tell you exactly when it was published. When I wrote it before 1966, certainly. And when I went up to work on my PhD at Missouri, I got up there. I quit my job at Texas Western College after teaching there for 10 years. I was an associate professor, tenured associate professor. We sold our house, gave up the job, went up there as a graduate to Missouri as a graduate student. Of course, they gave me a graduate assistantship to teach while I was there. I got up there. The first week I was there, I get a letter from World Publishing Company. They accepted my book. And the gist of it was, yeah.
You're not taping.
Yeah, I am, but it's okay, you can talk.
Would you like me to call up Northwest Grill and make it
I don't think we need one. We'll leave. Well, you can make it for like 6.
Yeah, you want Northwest Grill?
Yeah, yeah, that'll be fine. And anyway, they accepted the book and offered me a contract, but they had provisions. They had found one of their editors, and again, my brain's not working well, but was a well-known person, was to offer me advice on making changes in the book, and they wanted these changes made. But actually, they wanted about 1/3 of the book changed, and they wanted the finished product. This was, we went up in June of 1966. Did I say something like that? It goes 66, 67, 6. No, it was long before that. June of what would be 3 years before the 6-Day War?
64.
Huh?
64.
64. What I'm saying, June of 64, it was accepted. They wanted all this redone by October the 31st of that year. Now get this. I was starting on a PhD program, and I didn't want to spend my life up there, so I wanted to finish the PhD program fast in 2 years, which is almost unheard of.
Right.
I had to pass proficiency in 2 foreign languages. Missouri required that, proficiency in 2 foreign languages, in addition to all the coursework, and I was working half-time. At first I was teaching one class each semester, but after the first semester, they wanted me to be publications editor of the Freedom of Information Center. So I had to work from 8 in the morning to 12:30 every day as editor of this publication that they put out. Do all my graduate courses in the afternoons and evenings, and rewrite 1/3 of a novel, and pass my proficiency in 2 foreign languages.
And what about your family?
Oh, and I had a family, 2 young children, one in the 2nd grade and one in the 4th grade, who had their own problems, you know,
Sure.
readjusting and all. And by the time my son says, whenever he thinks of me, he still thinks of, when he goes to sleep, of a typewriter clicking at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And I did it. I really did it. And actually, I made the deadline, got it in October. They published it, and then it came out, and it looked really great, except for one thing. They did not coat the dust jacket. When I show it to you, you'll understand. The dust jacket was black, solid, practically solid black. And then I sent it out to reviews, you know, and told them who to review it. I got some 60 or 70 reviews, almost all of them good. A lot of them were really short blurbs. In the Jewish press and everything else, got good, really good reviews. And the book had a dust jacket that would not ship. In other words, by the time it got to a bookseller, it had scraped. They put them in boxes, and they scraped against each other, and there were just white streaks on everything.
What?
And about half the novels are bought as gifts. I didn't know that. I know it now. And nobody would buy this gift. It looked like it had been bought at a fire sale or something.
So it tanked because of its physical appearance?
So the physical appearance was awful. I'll show it to you. And so all the book world asked all the bookstores to send the book back for new dust jackets, which all the bookstores were happy to do because they couldn't sell them with the one that was on it. And World then neglected to send the book out again for about 8 months or something like that. All the reviews had come out, and when they did send it back, it seemed to me it's the same dust jacket that it had before. So it sounds like some kind of complaint of some jerk. It was sad that but this actually happened to me. It's all 7 years of work, all these hopes and everything.
Why? Okay, hold on. I'm sorry that I'm interrupting.
That's okay. I get emotional emotional when I talk about it.
Why did you write this novel? Why did you feel that you had an urge to write it?
Because I thought I had something was different. Almost nobody else. It turns out that the people who volunteered were not novelists or people that came out of World War I. There was very few people. They were not writers. Only one other guy wrote a novel. Michalnik wrote a novel. We were the only two. I mean, it was a subject that nobody had really written about, but I thought Americans would be very interested in. It was, I still do. But anyway, three years later, after all that, it was sort of a flop as a book. It sold several thousand copies, but that's not going to do very much for you. But a guy came through to work on another project who was a Jew and was a publisher of paperback books. And he read it and liked it, the hardback. And 3 years later, it came out in 2 paperback editions, one year and then 2 years later another one. But he changed the title, and it sold like 200,000 copies. The book sold around 200,000 copies in paperback. But you don't really get a reputation for books that come out in paperback. You get them, the reviews are all done on hardbacks.
So what was the story about?
It was disappointing. That was one of the.
Tell me what the story was about?
What?
Can you tell me what the story was about?
The story was about an American who volunteers for the Israeli army, And of course, there's a love interest of a Sabra girl, and the experiences of dealing with Israelis, you know, different to people who are Israelis. And I had him do different from me. He spoke Hebrew fluently. He had the studies and was more assiduous than I was. He spoke Hebrew, and I never had any love interest of met anybody my age. The Israeli army was only, you know, taking in people at 18. I was the lowest age that they took in. In my unit, for example, there were 5 women. There were 5 women in the 79th, and they're all secretaries, but they went into combat with us as radio operators on half-tracks. Yes, they actually went into combat as radio operators, but otherwise they were secretaries. So you got 5 nice-looking women, all of whom were older than me, number one, surrounded by 900, I won't say there are many, let's say 600 or 700 men between the ages of 18 and 35. And they were obviously not going to be any love interest in the middle of that. I mean, God, I never got lead. I didn't meet any Israeli girls my age ever.
What's the name of the book?
The book was called "Bring My Sons from Far," and it's from a biblical thing. Bring my sons from far and from the ends of the earth, etc. And in paperback, it has the most unforgettable name you ever heard: A Time of War, because in paperback you put books on genre shelves, you know, the war novels, travel, etc. And he thought this belonged with the war novels. I was a corporal with a Panzer unit and stuff like that. But it's so widely. I mean, it's so a lot. But I was getting like 3 cents a copy on the paperbacks. Sold for $1. It sold for $1. You know, in those days, maybe I got 1 cent a copy, and then the paperback, you could make a little money off of it, and I didn't make any money off of it.
Let's talk about other characters that were in Mahal.
It was character building.
I'm sure. I'm sure. What can you tell me about this character, Jesse Slade? What can you tell me about him?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I never met him, and a lot of the people, when they talk about themselves, maybe even complete in books and that, they're really different characters when you come up to them. For all I know, he was a goof off, and he was hard to get along with, and didn't do his job correctly even when he did it. But I mean, actually, somehow he found himself. I'm just making this up, of course. That's not true. So I didn't know much about him.
Are there any Mahal characters that you did know that are worth mentioning? That you believe?
Well, my best friend, it turns out we were in the same half track. We had lots in common. His name was Mortimer. Branya. What is Mort's last name? Levinson. Same thing as her name. But he spelled, forget about it. She spells her name Levinson. His name was Mortimer Levinson, Levinson. And his brother joined at the same time. So, you know, they went together. His older brother was like a year and a half older than he, still living in San Francisco. Mort is dead. Mort was the youngest person in the Israeli army, and I was the second youngest. And we ended up on the same half track. In other words, he was born a few months after I was born. We were both 18 years old. We became very fast friends, and friends for life. For life. Even though we were separated far apart, we saw each other almost every year, and we went on vacations together, family vacations together, and kept up with each other. We went on cruises together. we really loved each other like brothers. And he was a very fine person. He became an insurance man, and quite rich. He and his brother had the idea of going to the west coast of Boston, but totally different than me. His mother was a big Hadassah worker and gave them her blessings. She wanted them to go, whereas my mother nearly killed herself and killed me. But he had support from his family, because his mother used to say, how can I work all my life at Hadassah, and then when the time comes that you're needed by Israel, not let you go? That was her attitude. My mother was, I've worked all my life for Israel. What have they done for me lately? They don't need my son.
Can you tell me about the pin that you're wearing?
Yeah, this pin is very interesting because, not that I ever wore it on a uniform, or the Israelis didn't have pins in those days, but when they gave they gave pins, very few, they gave this pin if you served in the War of Independence, but not this menorah. This menorah could only be worn as a, what do they call it, a clasp, or they have another word for it. This menorah could only be attached to the pin if you were in Haganah, a Machal. They were the only people that got this, not even for bravery or anything else. So it meant a lot to me to wear this pin. I have tie pins, but not with this on it, with this little thing on it. I'm very proud of what I did, but the Israeli authorities recognized Machal for something special. So they gave it to anybody who served in Haganah before the war, and because they weren't going to give a combat ribbon for that. And for Machal, they attached this little menorah. Nice, isn't it? Yeah. So that was nice. There were some outstanding people that could tell really great stories, and I can't get my name around them now. There's one guy, and it's in my museum and everything else, and I can probably get that and show you, from Harvard, who had been a combat flyer of P-50, of P-47s and P-50s ones in the Second World War. And he was he became an ace, and he was so good that they brought him back, and this is tough for Israelis to do. They brought him back to command the Fort David, the Air Force Base. What is it? It's got David in the word. Ramat David.
Ramat David.
Ramat David, the Ramat David Air Base, and the commander of the air base and the instructor for all Israeli pilots. He was that good a pilot. He became an ace, not in World War II. He'd already shot down, and he was captured twice in World War II. And just a whole book could be written about him.
And you don't remember his name right now? It's okay.
I can find it for you in a minute. I've got the map here.
Now, how did it work with Machal people? They just
I'll give you the name later.
They just came and volunteered, and they were recruited, and they were...
Well, the only thing is, there would have been hundreds of people who would have joined if they knew where to go. It was, the thing is that you're threatened with losing your citizenship. The State Department put screws, on potential volunteers. They never heard of people could join the British Army or the British Air Force, and did. The Americans joined. They were, they became famous for doing that. And what you got for joining the Israelis was to lose your citizenship. Yeah. And they threatened you with that. And you saw the thing on every passport. It said, not valid.
Do you have your passport?
Yeah.
Where is it?
Yeah, I'll show it to you. Well, I'll show it to you later. Rather than show it to you. I got a picture of it in the thing there too. You want to see it? I got it here.
Sure, take it out.
I could get museum panels. I'd give you one of these, but I don't really have but one. I'd have them make copies for you.
Oh, that's not the original passport?
No. Oh, you want to see the original passport?
No, that's okay, or this.
I can show you the original passport too, but I'll show you pictures of I don't have all of these. This is.
Hold on, let me see. Let me up.
Yeah, I can see it. I can show you.
Wait, I actually need you to sit there because now.
Oh, okay.
I just need to have a look at this.
Okay, I wanted to show you where it was.
You could sit back though. It's okay.
Okay, I want to show you. Here it is, right here. If you read on the top of that, it says not valid, but I've got the passport here too.
You'll show me, yeah.
I can show you.
Yeah.
I've got all that stuff. In fact, I was thinking of maybe going and making a copy of this for you.
No, it's fine. I have it all photographed.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
But you'll see it all there.
So let's get the passport. I'm going to press stop.